So our very first lesson for our American Revolution series deals with the French and Indian War. Now, a number of years ago, PBS put together a documentary about the French and Indian War called The War That Made America. And often it's referred to as a forgotten war because it's overshadowed by the revolution. Even the name French and Indian War is unique to one perspective. It's unique to what we would refer to as the British North American perspective. The rest of the world calls it the 7 Years' War because for most of the world, the fighting took place from 1756 to 1763. Here in North America, it began 2 years earlier in 1754. So it really took 2 years for the actual combat to engulf the globe. Now, on one side, we have Great Britain. That's what the GB is. Great Britain and her colonial allies. Also allied with them are the Six Nations of upstate New York. They are fighting the French and her Algonquin allies. So the name French and Indian War is a bit odd. Yes, France fought the Six Nations, but they allied with the Algonquins, so it's kind of a weird name for this whole thing. Now, if you look at it through the lens of the Algonquin, so by and large, this native perspective, it made sense to ally with the French. They were very tolerant. They were much more likely to allow their trading partners to maintain their traditional way of life, so long as they continued to provide them with fur pelts. Now, the French set up trading posts like they did here in Wisconsin that we already saw during our last unit, and they didn't necessarily settle in great numbers like the British did. The British are more concerned with acquiring land, so hence more people. France, it's economics, it's trade. A couple of forts that might be garrisoned, but it's mainly for the purpose of making money. So there's this codependency that the fur trade helps facilitate. France also needed these natives as allies to counter the numbers of British. So they presented the natives with generous gifts and provided them with hospitality. Often, like with Marquette and Nicolet, they learned native languages, and many French traders would marry native women. Now, since a lot of these cultures are what we would call matrilineal, lineages passed through the mother, this served as a springboard to forge connections that were military alliances and commerce. And interestingly, the natives knew darn well the French needed them. They understood the situation where there weren't that many settlers. They used this to their advantage to get much better deals. Now, as to what started this whole thing, we have LT, that's long term, ST, that's short term. Now, in the long term, Great Britain and France both wanted control of the lucrative fur trade and the natural resources that came along with control of North America. We already started to see last unit that Great Britain claimed the East Coast, so what bordered the Atlantic. They claimed that up to the Allegheny Mountains. Meanwhile, further west, France claims New Orleans in the southwest, up to the Mississippi River, into the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway. The problem is they both tried to claim the Ohio River Valley, which was smack dab in the middle, and that's when the trouble begins. The French went to build a fort near present-day Pittsburgh, and that's where three important rivers converge. England interprets this as a threat. So long term, it's land. In the short term, our good friend George Washington is actually very much involved at the start of this. Now, Washington is 21 years old when he's tasked with leading an expedition to this Ohio River Valley. The British wanted to build a fort at the site of modern Pittsburgh, just like the French went to do. And France counters with plans to build forts from Lake Erie to the Ohio River. Now, Washington, by this point, is an experienced surveyor, and he's an officer in the Virginia militia. He was supposed to survey a good site for a military fort. He's supposed to make contact and ally with the leaders of these six nations, and he was supposed to convince the French to leave with force if necessary. Now, one member of Washington's party was the Seneca leader Half King. The Seneca are one of the six nations of what's now upstate New York. When Washington's party came upon a French party, they engaged in a preemptive strike, meaning they decided to attack first. They attacked the French force at the suggestion of Half King, and they killed 10 and captured 21. Unfortunately, one of those killed was an official French diplomat. You cannot do that. That's a no-no. So to make a long story short, yes, it was land, but the assassination of the French diplomat was kind of the excuse to start declaring war. Now, if we're going to sum this whole thing up, the fighting itself takes place from Quebec up in Canada all the way down to the Ohio River Valley. The British were schooled and they're drilled in European warfare, and this is mostly in open plains and fields, normally flat land. You can engage in line fighting, shoulder to shoulder. British officers such as Edward Braddock, he tries to continue forming lines of men when fighting, and he tries to level out hills and build bridges across all bodies of water. Now, Washington is a colonial. He understood that the natives would routinely ambush troops and use the terrain to their advantage, and he tried to warn Braddock of the threat, but his advice was seen as inferior. Colonials were seen as inferior to those that were born in Britain and British. Now, Britain undertook the largest military campaign in the colonies to date, and numerous times they came up short. But this leads the colonials to question whether or not they're invincible. See all this fighting in the woods, rural fighting in the country? England doesn't adjust to it. This notion of the mystique of Britain, the invincibility of Britain, all of that is thrown into question. Now, as we've touched upon, the Six Nations did side with Great Britain. The Algonquin and the northern Iroquois tribes, like the Huron, did side with the French. Six Nations went with Britain. And this was mainly because the French initially established trading partnerships with northern tribes like the Huron. And they intentionally excluded the Six Nations from these deals. Now, the Six Nations are among the best warriors, and they had the infrastructure to both sustain their population and wage long-distance war. They had the resources to do this. So they were a large help to the British side. And the British are going to attempt to revive this during the American Revolution. They're going to call upon this partnership again, even though there are two of these tribes that will ultimately back the colonial Americans in the Revolution. The Oneida and the Tuscarora will side with the colonists. Now, as previously mentioned, this eventually spills out and becomes what's known as the 7 Years' War. North America was just one theater. The fighting between the major powers of the time is going to take place in Europe, throughout the Americas, in West Africa, in India, and the Philippines, all over the world. Officially, this whole thing starts with the Austrian desire to reclaim land from Prussia. That's where we see Prussia down here. It's basically Germany. So the Austrians ally with France, and this drew the major powers into the fray. And Spain enters because they saw the success of the British, and they believed that the old balance of power was being upset. If you think back to our early American settlement unit, Spain was very powerful in terms of their colonial empire, but they're kind of starting to decline. Britain's on the rise, and the Spanish don't like it. They want to keep the old way intact. However, they lose Manila, which is in the Philippines, and Havana in Cuba, amongst other possessions, because of the extent of the fighting. That's why we say this was one of the first world wars. It's a legitimate global conflict. You'll discover throughout history that Paris is a fashionable place to end wars and sign treaties. So as the war ends, we look at the results. France loses all of their possessions that made up New France. So Canada, all claims east of the Mississippi River. They did keep a couple of their Caribbean islands like St. Lucia, Guadeloupe, Martinique, but otherwise they are the big loser. Now, Spain loses Florida to the British, but it gains Cuba back. It had been a Spanish colonial possession. This is Cuba. It was a Spanish colonial possession until Britain claimed it during the war. The Louisiana Territory was also ceded to Spain in a secret treaty, Treaty of Fontainebleau. And the land wasn't really seen as valuable. It was seen as a money loser. Spain believed that if they had this territory, so New Orleans and Louisiana, if they had this territory, it could be a buffer against growing Spanish power. Because at this point, Spain controls a large portion of what's now the west coast of America. New Spain, what will eventually be part of Mexico and then the US. They want it to serve as a buffer zone. As far as England is concerned, big winners. They are the big time victors in the French and Indian War. They get North America, so everything east of the Mississippi River and Canada. England even resettled groups of people known as Acadians. These are French Canadian settlers. They resettled them throughout their American colonies, but many went to New Orleans because it was expected to remain a French possession. Now, by and large, the French were willing to give up their North American claims because the sugar plantations in their West Indian possessions were much more profitable. You could make more money on that than their fur trading posts in North America. Now, Gibraltar was huge for Mediterranean trade. The Straits of Gibraltar connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. So if you can control that, you control who goes in and out. India actually was the big prize. Britain and France both had a presence in India prior to this. And the French did gain back some of the factories they lost, but they had to support the presence of the British government in India, and they were not allowed to post troops there. So this is the start of the Indian subcontinent coming under British control. England had now become the new empire. They're the new kid on the block. So Spain and France are going to begin to retool their militaries to prepare for the next conflict that might arise. England is now seen as too rich and powerful. I mean, there's a drawback to being on top. They're rich, they're powerful. So in the next major conflict to come, they're not going to have as many allies as they might have anticipated. Overall, this gives us a good indication of what life was like before the war, so before 1763, and then gains 1763. That would be after the French and Indian War. We can see that there's British possessions and there's also the very strong Spanish presence. So when we say Louisiana, we're talking about all of this land that they expected to serve as a rural buffer zone between growing and expanding British power in North America.